So you folks know plenty about the soil food web, but this is where this soil sponge thing is going on, and the ability to open those pore structures up with multiple techniques and start moving into this regenerative series of tools. This is Dr. Lal at Ohio State. I met with him. Anybody familiar with him? He's probably the most referenced person on soil carbon on the planet. Very interesting guy. He's written like 80 books or something. But he's saying that 2% increase in carbon content, that's a lot. The planet's soils could offset 100% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which actually that's probably very conservative. So getting back to Walter, he's basically also saying that, so I think the way that the news, that what we're listening to is that somehow if we were to like disappear all of the fossil fuel carbon, we'd be okay. That's kind of what they're inferring, right? It's like every car was electric. And so the flux is like this. It's going up 130 billion tons a year, carbon emissions, and plants are pulling down 120. So we're ratcheting up 10 billion every year, and 8 of the 130 is from fossil fuels. We can highly alter that 120 part with the vegetation that we were just talking about by increasing evapotranspiration, biomass growth, et cetera. So it's not at all the case that if we did only looked at CO2 gases when I already explained the other part. But so that's to me pretty key information. All right, jumping to the next thing, you guys know a lot about biochar already, I think, but I mean, this probably stunned me more than anything else I've ever seen human beings do. I can't think of the next thing in line after this, but 600 years later, after the last person did anything to make these black, dark soils of the Amazon what they are, probably over a 2,500 year period. It didn't happen overnight, but still, it's a phenomenal accomplishment. And I guess I get this maybe more than somebody who hasn't worked in the tropics, but I've tried to get organic matter to stick around in the tropics to make compost piles and watch whole compost piles turn into 1 5-gallon bucket in 8 months. It's like really hard to keep things from oxidizing in that kind of hot tropical heat. And here this is, an area the size of France, aggregated with 6.5, 7 foot deep black soils, where this is the natural soil of the place. I mean, it's just night and day, mind-boggling to me. So here's another leverage point. So all these things are leverage points, we can look at. And so adding heat to cellulose and moving it to at least 100 times or more durability of carbon before it oxidizes back into the atmosphere. If you put mulch or manure or almost anything on the surface of the soil, it's going to be back in the air in probably 12 years. Maybe 20 with wood chips. Some of that's going to be, if it's broken down by fungi, is going to be turned into humus, and that's actually probably the first choice. We can get it humus, but it's hard to get a lot of it real quick. However, I'm seeing organic matter increases in some farms that I'm looking at that I'm blown away by. Livestock systems particularly, faster than anything else I've seen. There's a lot to say about biochar. People fairly familiar already with all the benefits and things of biochar. It's pretty stunning. It raises all the capacities of soil, especially with the complexities of adding the right things to it. I think there's a lot of disinformation and kind of bogus information out there because of a misunderstanding of how you can. It's basically, I would look at it more as a battery, and definitely want to talk more about storage. I think. Talked a little bit about distributing production, whether it be power or food or water, distributing that out. So the analogy there is that healers understand that the difference between medicine and poison is dosage. And so that the decision to make of what scale to do something on, to me, is the dosage. And so this, you can do a really good idea that's been demonstrated at a small scale and scale that up. More of that good thing must be better and better and better. That's kind of what we generally do with our economic thinking and supply chains. And there's a point at which it becomes a poison. And so this is the xylem and phloem structure inside of the wood. So we can dismantle a lot of what's in the cellulose and burn off everything but the carbon and leave that skeleton behind to be this storage system for anions, cations, air, water, microbial life, basically a battery of the things that the soil is otherwise losing fairly quickly. And those soils that were draining water, this will hold, so any 1% of organic matter holds about 28,000 gallons of water per acre. I've seen systems with livestock farms with nothing but pretty high density cattle densities and electric fence and nothing else achieve a 3 percentage point increase in 4 years, which is stunning to me. It's about 80,000 gallons of water per acre on 400 acres on that particular farm. So that makes a massive difference on that equation of drying out and draining. You're going to be holding water. You're going to be holding your neighbor's water back, when it comes through. But
are you saying just pasture?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sort of begs certain questions. I've seen some pretty good soil building with cover crops are really amazing. I mean, they're amazing me more every year, especially as we're now getting into higher numbers of species in them. There was an interesting study that Christine Jones mentioned in, I believe it was Germany. It was kind of a long-term study with these plots of cover crops, and it went from 1 species to all the way up to 16, and I think higher. And in a drought, in a really serious drought event, everything died except for the plots that had 8 or more species in them. And the 8 species that were in those plots were the same species that were in the ones that died that didn't have the other diversity. So it's sort of pointing to the exudates from these plants that each plant species has different suites of exudates, so to speak, and feeding different types of microbes. So once you get up to about 8, apparently you're getting enough diversity of microbial activity to where it's holding enough moisture to make it through a drought event. So all these are pointing toward resilience as opposed to sustainability. That's just a straw version. I mean, it's not just wood. I tend to focus on wood more. Maybe I'll come out of that, but it's not very informative. But there's just a tremendous. We're going to be doing a workshop next week with there's like 55 different uses of biochar. I mean, if you put the biochar in a stucco on a wall, you're going to have sound insulation, thermal insulation. It'll even pull EMFs out of the air, and so we're being scrambled by not just EMFs, but a number of things that are changing the background frequency that we evolved with. People familiar with the Schumann resonance? It's a resonant cavity between the surface of the Earth and 60 miles up that is charged with a standing wave of about 7.83 hertz that is coming from lightning activity. And that's just the tuning that we are used to. And so that is becoming obscured by all these crazy waveforms that we're generating. And it's making it hard to access and adapt and the coherence and so forth. So a lot of what we're talking about is natural capital. It seems to be what, this is just interesting because it's a World Bank statement, but the natural capital seems to me to be what ecosystems do between major disturbance events to stack the deck to be able to be resilient. All these systems, kind of know they're going to get knocked around, but their ability to stand back up is directly proportional to the amount of natural capital. And so soil organic matter is one of those, but you've got all sorts of ecosystem services. There's some toward the end of this, I'll show you some really interesting new measurement tools that are very sophisticated compared to anything we've ever had before, and getting to the point where I think we can start to actually connect economic value to these. That farmers will be seen as service providers. You could call it, health practitioners in a way of systemic health, and as I mentioned before, all these health problems are generating faster than any economic system can cope with them. And the fires and the floods and the droughts are all stripping out. So Australia has, according to Walter, has dropped to like 2 out of 5 years of crop success. When you start getting to that level, or you start getting to these 500-year floods every 3 years, there's the insurance companies, the investors, all kinds of things start coming down, and they start becoming very interested in innovation. Anybody who can do this and survive, that's making it through those events with other techniques. And we're seeing certain farms, like Gabe Brown's, where in a 13-inch rain event took all of it in. Absorbed all of it. Didn't have any runoff. And so that translated to making it easily through the drought that was going to come next. And if you can show that you've done that, the insurance companies are going to say, yeah, we'll insure you. But if you're getting 2 out of 5 years crops, they're going to say, we can't touch you with a 10-foot pole. You can't afford enough money to be insured. And so then you start pulling the investors over, and then slowly all the other massive systems that are very attached to the status quo. So a lot of this conversation that we got into wasn't just about climate, but how do we actually shift the status quo from what it is to these innovators that step out here. What you don't want to do if you're an innovator is compare yourself in any way to the status quo. You do not want to sell your food in the same as if it's anywhere near equal. And we're starting to see massive changes in what's actually happening coming out of a healthy soil compared to monoculture chemical food. I think where this is going to go is that the present price of food will probably maintain itself only by those that can produce really high nutritional quality. And everything else is going to go to junk status, because it will make you sick. You won't be able to afford the money to pay for the implications of eating it. And that will be teased out. We got a grant application and we're going to find out this month, and got you guys in on it if it does happen, where it's going to be like 360 farms in 8 states and all completely linked laterally into an open source database, and looking at soil, accelerated soil health, and using very flexible in terms of what that means to you, and let everybody try their own thing, and then everybody's learning from each other. And it's going to go for 5 years, and by year 2, you can say, wow, whatever I had was just not going anywhere, and I see that guy over in 3 states away is really making some headway. I'm going to shift over to that. So it's got all this potential. But there's 3 tiers of growers, and the 3rd tier will be measuring, I believe, because one of the partners in this thing is the people that developed the handheld mass spectrometer, which you guys have. So the thing that's kind of stunning us is that there was a 20,000% variation in polyphenols and antioxidants in carrots in the first year this was measured, and not even a massive data set. So we're going to be finding things out that a lot of the big producers are not going to be happy about, because they will not be able to compete in this new world where nobody's going to afford to be able to be that sick and eat that kind of food to become that sick. Okay, so this is this basic succession. I mean, the one I showed you in the tropics of the rotation was a little bit like this, except it was, maybe here or here to here. But basically in nature, when you're going from just really, after a volcano or something major or a mall, whatever, to go back to this, there's a lot to learn from playing that movie forward a few thousand years or so, in terms of what is it really trying to do. This is where the natural capital is being built, and it's clearly banking as much as it can in order to get to the next level. So in those early phases, you get little, pioneer plants out here. Well, the lichens in a way are the ultimate pioneers. They sort of built the proto-soils about 420 million years ago that started. But so the first pioneer plants are creating a little bit of shade and a little bit of a niche, in the back behind that plant by plants that couldn't have grown by themselves out in the sun. And then this thing just takes off. So as you go from left to right, you're basically seeing it move toward, a dominantly perennial, genetically rich polyculture higher in biomass. It's conserving water and water quality. It's conserving and building topsoil. It's maximizing symbiotic relationships, as we mentioned in the tropical system. Moderating climatic extremes. There's more and more efficient use of on-site energy, complex nutrient cycling systems, and everything has multiple functions. So that's about exactly the opposite of what you generally see driving across North America in, standard agriculture. You could just read this backwards. Dominantly annual, genetically poor monocultures of hybrids that are low in biomass, decreasing water and its quality, losing and polluting topsoil, minimizing symbiosis, emphasizing competition, increasing climatic extremes, reducing microclimates, wasting on-site energy and resources and bringing them in from far away, and single functions. So if you knew nothing else and just went exactly opposite of what the mainstream is doing, you'd be pretty close to right on the money on that one. So it seems to me that almost every landscape needs to be transforming in some certain ways to become more resilient for what's coming. And these are all really good strategies. Clearly the riparian forest buffers and going from the pastures we're seeing in these droughts that, in dairies and other operations in the middle of a drought with and without trees is really dramatic in terms of the animal health and productivity. The forest farming is an interesting one because it seems what I'm seeing, other than old growth forest, which are already kind of naturally thinned in the understory, and they probably shouldn't do a whole lot with them because they're already kind of close to the goal. But you can go in and work with the native populations of medicinal plants and mushrooms and non-timber forest products without harming anything. The equivalent of that cacao plantation. But the younger forest growth is generally really dense. It's too dense, so it's competing. The trees are competing with each other, and so they're producing less nuts. They're producing less habitat potential for the nut-eating animals and the ungulates that would be grazing on some of the grasses and forbs. So by going into those, but more importantly, they are extremely fire-prone. So the fires that are potentially building up, and we generally tend to think, at least where I am, that we're kind of semi-immune because it's so wet and green most of the time, but we were really close. We just got a 3-inch rain, but we were within a couple of weeks of seeing really serious fires. And once these kind of Smokey the Bear fire suppression landscapes have built up that much of a fuel load, they will burn at a heat that's maximum destruction. Unlike the traditional Native American fire management that was happening, not just Native America, but in Australia and pretty much every continent by Native peoples, was frequent cool burns that are selecting for a more open understory with lower amounts of fuel load and less competition, better animal habitat, more nutrients available, etc. So there's a big opportunity in those systems to pull out a lot of that material by hand and run them through pyrolysis, make electricity, make hot water, make season extension, walk-in coolers, all the things that we're looking at, hoping to put together, and still get biochar out of it at the end that's going to go back and head toward those terra preta soils. So so you see the same thing. So in the forest, you're thinning to do that. But in the silvopastoral systems, you're planting these trees in, and you can do them in a way where you can plant species that are already high value feed plants. Steve Gabriel at Cornell just wrote a book on silvopastoral crops and trees, and so there's certain species that the leaves of the trees are already on par with high quality feed. So they can be pollarded or cut above the level of the animal and dropped and let the animals eat the leaves and then pick up the branches and again make biochar or mushrooms. I mean, I think we're not a single track thing here. What we need to do is get a lot of this wood to rot. We can use livestock to do this too, but you want to keep those high amounts of fuel load from burning. And there's a lot of different strategies to do that. But certainly, since we have to do electricity anyway, and a lot of times, in the winter, there's just not enough solar energy. It's beautiful backup system in the wintertime to make lots of extra heat and electricity charged batteries. I'll show you my system in a minute, or maybe whenever we get to it. And so then that leaves the agricultural areas that are way too open to withstand the intensity of that, implications of that 410 parts per million CO2 and the warming that's happening. So we need to really do a similar thing as why we need to do it in the tropics. The thin soils and hot sun equals the need for canopy. And I didn't see it coming really as quickly as it has. But now that we have such thin soils with all this abusive agriculture and the sun's heating up, the tropical strategies are starting to look really relevant to us pretty much all over the country. And again, it's easier to harvest in a situation like the silvopastoral or so the alley cropping. This is just a simple example of tree crops. It's windbreak. It doesn't dry out as much. There's a lot of potential for that. But you can go through and harvest these like those systems I was mentioning with the leguminous trees in the tropical system, and then chip those, manage the sunlight to where you're not getting too shady for your crops. But there's a lot of things that can be woven into here, not just single species, but lots of, you could put food plants in and then thin out the non-food plants and chip them, and then they'll coppice and just manage all of that in a very similar way as we already talked about. This is the bump I was mentioning earlier with the cirral stages and the edges. You see this number of species bump here between land and water, but you see it also with older growth and younger growth with creating little openings. That pretty much speaks for itself. Yeah, that's the alley cropping, one type. There's a lot of variation in all of these things, but just using plants more efficiently in general, deeper roots, better soil holding capacity, dealing with slopes. Yeah, the silvopastoral thing is, I think, pretty exciting when you get the best of the grazing, like the organic matter increases that I was mentioning, plus tree growth on top of it, and the deep tap roots. We're starting to look at walnuts and the ability to press walnut oil and use the shells. You guys have already tested walnuts, right?
Yeah,
Richard? Yeah, it should be a fine, but to be able to get that as a byproduct of a tree crop that's already shading pasture systems that are already really productive for other reasons, that these things start to really cascade.